Here's what you've been missing over at patreon.com/Addressing Gettysburg.
You're listening to Addressing Gettysburg.
Hi guys, hi listeners. Back again today to do another podcast for you. Today, this is Kendra Debany, by the way, from Gettysburg House Histories. And today I thought we'd do, usually I talk about, in the future, I will be talking about different houses, but for this podcast, I thought what I'd like to do for you is to talk in general about an 1863 farm. So we're going to talk about what an 1863 farm would have looked like. We're going to talk about houses, we'll talk about barns, we'll talk about outhouses, we'll talk about fields, crops, and anything else that pops into my head. So this one we may go off on a tangent a little bit because this is my cup of tea. So, and what I would like to do, as we go through and I start describing different features of a house and different features, what I want to do is to use the houses on the Gettysburg battlefield as a reference points for you. Since so many of you are familiar with the houses on the battlefield, I thought I will point out examples of what I'm talking about using the houses on the battlefield. Actually, when you think about it, the battlefield is a great example of what an 1863 farm house and farm setup would have looked like, minus, of course, the post-battle era structures, which are scattered around here and there. But there's a nice variety of sizes and construction materials out there, lots of examples of what the fields might have looked like at the time, and a good mix of orchards and meadowland, farming fields, woodlots, different types of fencing, and so on and so on. Since most listeners are familiar with the battlefield, I thought this was a great way to kind of combine everything for you. So let's start by talking about an 1863 house. And actually, before I start, I want to just say, for this presentation, for this podcast, we are talking about a farm. So we'll save the borough houses for another talk. So when I'm talking about different things, this is in reference to what a house on a farm would have looked like at the time of the battle, not necessarily a borough house. So a house in 1863, let's start with a little bit about the building materials. Now, at the time of the battle, there were basically 4 types of houses in the area: log, stone, brick, and wood frame houses. Again, when I refer to the area, I am talking about Gettysburg and Adams County. So in this general vicinity, you may say, well, hey, I live, near Philadelphia, and that's not the case here. This is in reference, all the dates I talk about, the transition periods, the building booms, the changes in construction, everything is happening in this area. And after 10, 12 years, 15 years of looking in people's houses and digging around in basements and attics and noticing changes and outbuildings, this is kind of the time frames where I see changes. This is stuff that I see. So not necessarily the same goes here that happens in Ohio or happens in New England or happens in other places. So remember, this is what you would have seen in 1863 in this Gettysburg area. At the time of the battle, we had 4 types of very prominent houses: log, stone, brick, or wood frame. The farms in the area had a higher percentage of stone and log houses at the time of the battle, while the boroughs in urban centers had a higher percentage of brick and wood frame. So you would have seen way more brick and wood frame in the boroughs. The vast majority of the houses on farms were of the smaller to average size. So I've been in a lot of houses in Adams County, as I just said, over the years. And if I had to put an estimate on the average house size, I would say it would be anywhere from 1,300 to 2,000 square feet. So some are on the smaller, some are on the average size. Now, let's clarify a few things about log houses. So we'll start with log houses. Just because it's built of log, it doesn't mean that the house is super duper old. That is a huge misnomer. When people see a log house, I can't tell you how many owners I've walked into a log house and have said, my house is so old, it was built in the 1740s, it's log, it's old. Yes, your house is old, but not necessarily that it was built in the 1740s old. Actually, I don't know of any log houses that are still standing that have been built in the 1740s. I can tell you that as late as 1870, log houses were still being built in this area. So what you think is 1740 may actually be 1870. I haven't seen, there aren't a lot being built at that latest stage, but there are some. So there's the first thing for you to keep in mind. Log houses don't necessarily mean that they were here during the battle. But yes, there were a lot of log houses here at the time of the battle. Some might have been built in 1780 or before, or a little bit right around the 1780 time period. And up to 1870. Some of these super older first generation log houses, a lot of times they were dismantled and reused for something else, which we'll talk a little bit more later about recycling. Another thing about log houses, after a certain point in time, log houses became very unfashionable. So if you owned one, the chances are that you wanted to cover it up and hide it. Some people encased their homes in brick, but the majority of them would put clapboarding over the log to make it look like the newer, more popular wood frame house. So at the time of the battle, some people had exposed logs. Some people actually had their logs covered with clapboarding to make them look more modern. The clapboarding over the logs also served several other purposes. They protected the logs from weather-related rot. You didn't have to treat them, so they were protected, and they provided an extra layer of insulation. If you live in an old house, you know how important that is. Now, when you're driving through this area today, consider that a lot of the houses that you're seeing, which look like just normal wood frame houses, may actually be log houses underneath. I'm good at it now. I can just drive by, take a look at a house and say, yep, log, just by the layout of how the windows are spaced and how it looks and how the window size is. So keep an eye out for that. Now, in terms of cost, brick houses were the most costly to build because you had to have the bricks made on site. The process was very tedious. You had to have if you had to have the materials available on your site, then you had to have the bricks made. You had to have the bricks dried. It was a very long and tedious process. And a house needed thousands of bricks, so it was very, very costly. Alternatively, you could buy the bricks, also exceedingly costly. One thing that I see all the time in houses in the area is houses being built of recycled materials. I cannot tell you how many times I'll go in to inspect a house for an owner, and the owner tells me, my house is super, super old. I have logs in my basement. A lot of times, as I just mentioned previously, the previous buildings on the property were torn down and the logs were recycled for other purposes. Very common to see recycled logs being used for floor joists in later houses. The first thing I always do when I go into a basement and look for signs of recycling on logs. Any kind of sign that the logs were used in another structure, so V-notching or any kind of notching, cutouts, or any kind of sign that they came from somewhere else. And in a number of cases, I can see, hey, this these logs actually came from another structure. So then I know that the house in question is not built as early as the owners think. Now, the farmers in this area throughout the years, they recycled everything. So a lot of what you see out there built today, or that's still standing, was built using materials from other buildings. The same thing holds true in barn construction, which we'll talk about in a little bit. So they recycled everything. And it's really fun if you own an old home to go looking to see if there's any kind of signs of recycled materials in your house. Next, let's talk about orientation. I'm going to preface this next part by saying never say never. And there is always the exception to the rule. So the following is the general guidelines for orientation on a house. Yes, there's special cases where this won't hold true. So never say never. But in general, generally speaking, houses built before the Civil War faced east or southeast. And in later years, the orientation changed and houses were fronted along the roads. In some lucky instances, and I use the term lucky lightly, they faced roads and they faced east or southeast. For me, that becomes a little more difficult to date a property when they do both. You have to keep in mind that many of the houses built in this area were built long before the roads that we're familiar with today were even constructed. Now, back then, you were connected farm to farm by old farm lanes, which led you to a few main roads, including which then led you to the major market centers, such as York. So you were Tawnytown Road, Emmitsburg Road. Some of the secondary roads were not here super early on when the old houses were built. Again, we're just talking about farmhouses here. We're not talking about in-town properties, which absolutely fronted on the street. So in a later episode, we're going to talk about the Tilly Pierce house, and that being built in 1829. You would think, well, that's going to face south. It's going to face southeast or east, because it's built before the Civil War, but it actually does not face that in that direction. So actually it does. Actually, the front of it, now that I think about it, actually it does face east. So it's one of those properties that does do both. So hey, lucky for them. But and a lot of town properties that are built before, earlier, are facing the wrong way. So let's get back to the battlefield. Let me give you a few examples of houses that are built, just with the farm lanes and facing the right direction. Prime examples are the Trossel Farm, the front of the Trossel Farm. If you're familiar with this, over on United States Avenue, fronts in that direction. The Rose Farm, the Sherfy Farm. So the front of the house is facing in that general direction. Now one I want to talk about is the Bushman Farm. A lot of people think that the front door of the Bushman Farm faces the Emmitsburg Road or Confederate Avenue, but actually the front of the Bushman Farm is not the side that you can see when you're driving on the park roads. It is actually, the front door would have actually been on the opposite side of the house. Now this I know for sure, and another way to check this is you would not have gone into the house at the back of the staircase. So if you've ever been in the Bushman Farm, or if you can Google it online to look at the interior pictures, the staircase, it's actually on the real front of the house. You walk in and the staircase is off to your left going up. If you had come in off the Emmitsburg Road side of the property, you would be entering where the basement door is and where the back of the staircase was. So that was not the front door. So that's just a little tidbit on that. Now, sometime...
Catch the rest of this episode and support the show over at patreon.com/addressinggettysburg.